Hi, this is Christian Cayley, and this video podcast is on several of the canons of statutory construction that are known by their Latin phrases. Basically, for purposes of statutory construction, the courts and bill drafters use a series of canons to guide them. And these include textual canons that we often refer to as intrinsic aids, as well as linguistic presumptions and grammatical conventions, substantive canons, and extrinsic aids. Now, it's nearly impossible to list all of them, but there are definitely some common canons, and these are some of the most useful for legislative drafting and statutory interpretation. We start with the presumption that the legislature drafts its bills carefully and intentionally. Because of this presumption, the usual approach of the judicial branch is to narrow statutes rather than expand them, and the courts are generally less activist in their interpretation. The first Latin canon is adjustum generis, and this guides the courts to interpret catch-all phrases to be limited by the specific words around them. Former US Supreme Court Justice Anthony Scalia said, "What category would come to a reasonable person's mind?" And his opinion was that this canon narrows a statute, the catch-all phrase, by the surrounding words in the remainder of the statute. The Latin phrase adjustum generis means of the same kind, and it's used regarding related content in a statute. In other words, this canon of statutory construction requires that where there are general words in a statute following particular and specific words, then the general words must be confined to things of the same kind as those that were specifically mentioned. Now, this canon is generally used for interpreting what we'll call loosely written statutes. Again, it's used if the statute lists certain things and the list ends with a general statement to include other things. Legislative drafters refer to this as a catch-all. In these instances, a court will assume that the general statement only includes things that are similar to the specific items listed. For example, if a statute says cars, motorcycles, scooters, and other motorized vehicles must be licensed, then the court's unlikely to require things like boats, trains, planes to be licensed as well. The next Latin term canon is expressio unius. And expressio unius provides that a list of words with no catch-all means that the inclusion of the specific word suggests the exclusion of other words. The full Latin phrase of this canon is expressio unius est exclusio alterius, which means that the express mention of one thing excludes all others. In other words, when a statute includes a list of specific items, that list is presumed to be exclusive, and therefore the statute only applies to the listed items and not to other items that are not listed. However, note that if the list starts with a phrase like at a minimum or including, or the list ends with a general catch-all term, then it's more likely that a court is going to interpret the list as illustrating the types of things that the statute applies to and not as an exclusive list. The next Latin-based canon of statutory construction is in pari materia, which means on the same subject or the same subject matter. And this doctrine of statutory interpretation means that statutes that are on the same subject must be construed together. In other words, if a statute is ambiguous, the court may apply this canon and look to the rest of the statute or the surrounding statutory scheme where these code sections come from in order to determine the meaning of the ambiguous statute. The next and final Latin-based canon of statutory construction is called nociter a socius, and it guides us to interpret words or phrases in light of the other words around the statute. As an example, the court should interpret an ambiguous word or phrase by taking into account that word or that phrase and its use in its textual context. Now, some legal commentators have opined that words are defined by the company they keep along along the lines of the Nocitor canon. The following is an example. Each classroom shall be provided paper, binder paper, printer paper, cardstock, and colored paper. In this case, what is the first paper referring to? Under the Nocitor canon, the first paper would be something related to the binder paper, printer paper, cardstock, and colored paper. Perhaps writing paper, but probably not receipt paper. In other words, items used in the classroom are likely to stand out given the context provided by the other words in this statutory sentence. So the Nocitor canon of statutory construction helps determine the meaning of an unclear or ambiguous word that should be determined by considering the words with which it is associated in its context. And so Nocitor associus is used for interpreting questionable words found in a statute.